Another aspect that you talk about is thinking with our spaces. And of course, this makes me think about my therapy space, think about my home environment, think about all sorts of spaces, and how much our spaces impact our cognition, impact our mood. You talk about natural spaces and built spaces. So let's start with natural spaces, because there's certain things that I intuitively have done in my office. I always have fresh flowers in my office. I when I was setting up my office, I put it so that my client would be facing the doors that open up to outside, as opposed to facing the other way. So there's just ways that I kind of intuitively sensed it out. But I think I was following some of the research that you outlined so well around natural spaces and their impact on our thinking.
Yeah. Well, from here, your space looks like a treehouse almost. Like you have a lot of natural light and views. So, in a way, it's to respond in the way that you have to the outdoors and to want to bring it indoors is really following the blueprint of our evolutionary history. Because human beings evolved in the outdoors, all our perceptual systems, were they evolved to process the kind of information and the kind of stimuli that we encounter outside. And so this world where that we inhabit now, where we're inside almost all the time, either in our cars or inside buildings or in an urban built up kind of setting, is very unnatural in the sense that those aren't the conditions under which we evolved. And so I think you're right, Diana, that we have a kind of intuitive sense that when we go outside, and this was another thing I loved learning about, because I love learning the why of why something, you may believe something or feel something, but then to know why is so interesting. So we all have that sense, or many of us have that sense, that when we go outside, it's calming, it's relaxing. We know that if we spend some time outside, we feel restored and relaxed. But why is that? It's because again, the kind of stimuli that we're taking in outside, all those beautiful green leaves and the clouds in the sky and the grass and the flowers that we're looking at, those sights and sounds are really easy for our brains to process. It's really effortless to process those things, unlike the very hard edged attention that we have to bring to, say, a screen full of symbols and numbers. So we're kind of refilling our attentional tank when we're outside. We're refilling the tank of our attentional resources. So then when we come back inside and we need to focus on our work, whether it's working with a patient or turning to a screen, we have more of those attentional capacities at our disposal, and so I find it useful to think about not just spending attention or directing it or managing our attention, but actually when are you restoring your attention? When are you refilling that tank? We think so much about the demands on our attention, but not so much about how to replenish the supply.
I loved what you wrote about fractals in nature,
Yeah.
and it just makes me so the fractals being those repeated patterns, and I'm looking at like the sunflowers behind me, or
Mm-hmm.
a succulent that
Mm-hmm.
we in Santa Barbara we have a lot of succulents because we have no water.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Mm-hmm.
but how just resting our eyes on fractals changes the way
Mm-hmm.
that we feel. Can you share a little bit about that?
Yeah. So as you mentioned, fractals are repeated patterns, often repeated, the same shape repeated at different scales. So if you think of like a fern, the frond of a fern, there's that same sort of scroll-like shape, but it's repeated from the tiniest leaves at the tip all the way to the big leaves at the bottom. And the reason that the reason scientists believe that fractals are so calming and restorative for us to look at, and fractals are found everywhere in nature, in the ocean waves and coastlines and mountains and clouds, and also most visibly in plants. The reason they're so relaxing for us to look at is that scientists increasingly think that the brain is like a prediction machine. It's always trying to predict what will come next. And with fractals, it's very easy to make that prediction because it's one shape after another, just sort of varying in size. So again, the brain, it has this very satisfying and very effortless experience of predicting what it will see next, and then having that prediction come true over and over again when we're outside in nature. So when we're in an urban space, the reason we can find that so jangling and jarring is that there may be an elaborate building next to a sleek, modern one, it's like our brains never know what's going to come next. So that's one reason why we find being outside so much more relaxing and restorative than navigating an urban setting.
Beautiful. So that's a good tip for all of us, that when we can take these sort of like mini restorative
Hmm.
moments to go outside, look at a repeating pattern in nature, and that kind of gives our brain a little bit of a rest. And a lot of times we go to our phone to scroll
Right.
thinking that we're going to get a rest, but that's
Right.
not actually giving us that restoration.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Because there's another part that's about having the experience of awe, which is much more likely to happen in these vast spaces of nature than in looking at our tiny little screens. But
Yes.
there's also a benefit in terms of what's known as cognitive offloading. I find it interesting that we tend to celebrate the ability to do things in our heads. We admire people like a chess grandmaster who can plan out multiple moves in advance and do that all in their heads, or a mathematician who can do really complex operations in their heads. But in fact, it's usually more efficient and effective to get ideas and information out of our heads and onto physical space where we can then relate to that information differently. We can manipulate it and move it around like it's a three-dimensional object, which we can do with post-it notes, for example. I'm a really big fan of post-it notes when I'm planning out a chapter or an article. And we can also navigate through a landscape of information when we've sort of spread it all out, like on a big whiteboard or a big bulletin board. And when we do that, we can bring in all these embodied resources that otherwise get wasted when we just have information inside our heads, like our spatial memory, for example. Human beings have this really powerful spatial memory where we remember where things are. And so when things are sort of stably located, once we've sort of sorted them out into categories or columns, then we can use our spatial memory and sort of navigate through that landscape of information like it's a three-dimensional landscape. Whereas things on our computer, our windows and our scrolling and our kind of zooming in and out, we lose a sense of the physical placement of things. And so that can be more cognitively draining and less helpful in terms of thinking about complex information.
There's two ways in which I use this as a psychologist. One is there's actually this really useful tool called a chain analysis that was developed in dialectical
Hmm.
behavior therapy. And what
Hmm.
you do in a chain analysis is you write down like a problem behavior, and you
Hmm.
actually take a piece of paper, you sit down next to your client and you're like, "What's your problem behavior?" And you're like, "I yelled at my kids this morning." And then you go through and you make these little like links, like chains,
Hmm.
going back in time and going forward in time.
Hmm.
And as you make the links and chains in the chains going back in time, you have the client write down in those links what were the links that led up to
Hmm.
that yelling at your kids. So it could be like, I
Hmm.
didn't have breakfast and I read this email. And then you also look at the links in terms of the consequences. And
Hmm.
when you
Hmm.
map that out with a client and
Hmm.
you can actually see these links on a piece of paper, then you
Hmm.
have a better sense of where you could have intervened. And then
Hmm.
also the consequences and how they are related to the thing that you want to change. It's super helpful. And I never
Hmm.
had an understanding of that. What we're actually doing there is thinking about it outside of our heads and actually on paper.
I
And so
wonder if
that's,
putting
yeah,
it down on paper also allows people to take a step away from it,
yeah.
it gives a helpful kind of psychological distance that they wouldn't get if it were still inside them, inside their heads.
And break it up, because
Mhm.
I think a lot of times we think of our experience as just one big thing. And when you can put it on paper, sort of like the post-it note, when you can make it sort of these moving parts,
Mhm.
then you can work with it better. But then the other way that I use that as a therapist, and your work kind of helped me see this, is um, in actually writing down things and moving them about in the office. Like, how close is your critic to you right now? Is it right up next to your
Hmm.
eyes, or is it
Hmm.
like,
Hmm.
all the way
Mhm.
across the room? And
Huh.
in that, using space in that way as well, I think is another way of kind of communicating metaphorically about
Mhm.
what's happening internally in our experience. Because sometimes our
Yeah.
thoughts can feel really right up close and sometimes they can feel further away. So it's
Yeah.
interesting.
And those are really grounded, embodied metaphors too. They really draw on the body's feelings of, is this person or this, mental image close to me or far away? Like that seems really, it seems to really draw on the body's resources in a skillful way.
Yeah. So if you're the type of person that wants to put things on Post-it notes and make lists and diagrams and all of that, it's actually a helpful cognitive tool. It doesn't mean that there's something wrong with you that you can't just keep it all in your
No.
head, which I think some of us feel that way.
Yeah, and that's something I wanted to push back against with this book is the idea that that thinking only counts if it goes on inside your head. Thinking is useful and valuable wherever it happens. And in fact, some of the most adept thinkers, experts in their fields tend to be more adept and more frequent users of thinking outside the brain. That's a skill that they have acquired that I think the rest of us could emulate when we want to think well, as too.
In your book, you talk about everyone from Jackson Pollock to Darwin to all these
Mhm.
different big thinkers and creators and how
Mhm.
they've used these different practices of thinking outside in different
Mhm.
ways. One more thing I want to touch on, and more as we're talking about thinking in spaces, is just our workspaces and what you
Mhm.
learned about in terms of what are the most beneficial ways to set up our workspaces. Because
Mhm. Mhm.
we started out with like walls and getting your office, and then we moved to these big open floor plans where everyone can talk
Right.
to everyone and hear everyone else on the phone. And
Right.
what did you learn through your research there about what
Yeah.
is the best way to set up our workspaces?
The book makes a really passionate case against the open office, because it's so poorly designed to work with the human tendency to be distracted by auditory and visual stimuli. I wonder if the pandemic kind of took care of the open office because lots of us are working at home these days. But then again, it may actually have accelerated some elements of that trend towards an open office because I'm hearing from people in corporate settings and organizational settings that people don't have their own desks anymore because people aren't coming in every day, and so there's a trend afoot that I'm kind of concerned about, which is some people call it hot desking or hoteling, which means that instead of having your own desk or your own office area, you kind of grab whatever space is available, and it wasn't where you were yesterday, and it won't be where you are tomorrow. And that worries me because so much of what I discovered in the research for the chapter on thinking with spaces is that it's really important for us to have a space that we feel to work and think in a space that we feel like is ours, that we feel like is our turf, and that we have power and control over. And also that we've filled with our own, what researchers call evocative objects, these signs and cues and symbols that either remind us of who we are, that are cues of identity, or that remind us of groups that we belong to, valued groups that we belong to. So cues of belonging. And so, fortunately for those of us who work at home, we have control over our space, and that's something we can readily put into action in our space at home. And I've even heard of people in these new kind of hybrid offices having a locker, where they keep photographs of their family or the little objects that really are meaningful to them. And they take them out and array them on their desk, whatever desk they're at that day. So I think there are ways to work with even the new pandemic era arrangements.
Yes, what was it, the CEO of Airbnb that is now saying that everyone can go in his office, they can all work from home, and kind of encouraging people to go to Airbnbs and work in all these different places around the world. But that's wonderful. There's something
Uh-huh.
freeing about that, but then there's also something that's ungrounding about it, in
Hmm.
terms of when we have the cues that remind us of work or remind us of belonging, or remind, for me, it's like I know that when I walk in my therapy office space, this is where I do therapy, and there's like a different feeling that washes over me when I
Hmm.
come into this space, as opposed to when the times that I have done therapy in my guest room, or it feels
Hmm.
a little bit ungrounded to me. So in our home spaces, where I see people having more trouble, is it's not their coworkers walking in on them, it's like their dogs and the FedEx
Yeah.
person and their kids and the
Yeah.
refrigerator that's right there and so distracting because you can get a snack anytime you want. Those kinds of things are challenging for folks. But
And that speaks, I think, to the fact that we have many identities, and the things that are around us, the objects and spaces that we see can cue or prime one or more of those identities. And so some of the trouble that we may have working from home is that, being home primes this identity of being someone who's cleaning up the house or who's taking care of kids, and not the professional identity that in that moment we want to be inhabiting. So I think
yeah.
that's another reason to think about when you are working, what are the objects, what are the signs and symbols that you see around you, and are they affirming that particular identity of a worker, a thinker, a creative person, whatever it is you need to be in that space.
Yes, my husband's been home this past week working from home because he had a little bit of a cold and he didn't want to go in and spread it. And it was like 10 o'clock in the morning and I was working on something and he came and he said, I have all this work to do. I think I'm going to roast some coffee.
Right.
I was like, right, because you're
Right.
home. And isn't
Yeah, of
it,
course.
more fun to be in the identity of a coffee roaster than
Of course.
than do those emails? So yeah, we have
Mhm.
to kind of adopt that identity.